Healthcare is too expensive. Employers are offsetting costs onto their employees. Who will make health benefits affordable for hardworking Americans and their families? You will. This is the Empowering Plans Podcast, a show dedicated to helping you once again emphasize the benefit in benefit plan. Now prepare to learn, plan, save, and protect with the FIA Group.
Welcome to the Empowering Plans Podcast. This week you've got Corey and Nick jumping back on the mics again. We're here to talk through a few of the trends that we've sort of picked up on, kind of percolating through all of the normal end of the year chaos and madness. A few things that we can sort of tease out, explain sort of where things have been going, where they're going to be going in the future. I think that from my perspective at least, we've been seeing sort of a push and a pull from a regulatory perspective. And this is sort of me being on the PGC side, the consulting side of FIA. I feel like I'm mostly seeing a set of regulations that have been either loosened up with carve-outs and exceptions, kind of tightening back up, and a few regulations that have been implemented but postponed, finally taking effect. So that's going to be a lot for plans to look out for the next year. And then we've also seen kind of a push, kind of nudging the compliance ball down the field a bit, changing what plans have to do, how they have to react to situations they might see coming up. And I think, Corey, you've seen a little bit of that playing out sort of on your end of the as well. Can you kind of elaborate on some of what y'all have seen on your side?
Yeah, absolutely. We have been knee deep in the No Surprises Act and the implications that come from the No Surprises Act and kind of the ripple effects that have kind of touched a lot of different aspects of provider relations. And honestly, it's changed the way that providers have been handling balance bills that are not No Surprise Act eligible. So I got a couple of case studies we can talk about on that end. And then we've also seen some uptick in provider appeals. And, while I can give my insight on why I think that we've been seeing that. But before we go much further, Nick, how was your Halloween? A lot of trick-or-treaters out there in Houston?
Thanks for asking. Yeah, actually, I think there was some pent-up trick-or-treat demand from the last couple of years of the pandemic. I've been here about just over a year now, and last Halloween it was not this crazy, at least from what I remember. But we had so many trick-or-treaters, we ran out of candy, had to do a quick emergency run down to the local Walgreens to pick up a couple bags of Reese's just so that our house wouldn't get egged. But no, it was pretty good. And then on top of that, probably the biggest thing, my fiance and I won a Halloween costume contest. So we're pretty proud of ourselves for that one.
Most excellent. And your costume was?
So we did a couple's costume. We were Wesley and Buttercup from Princess Bride.
Oh, classic. The Crigger family was an assortment of toys from Toy Story. I was Woody.
Oh, excellent.
My wife was Bo Peep. My daughter was Jessie. And my youngest daughter was Rex. So she liked walking around the neighborhood and roaring at the other kids. So it was fun for all.
Once your twins get here, you'll have a couple little green men you can throw in too.
Yeah, starting to coordinate 6-person themed costumes. I'm real excited about it. Can't wait to get there. You know what? Anyone who has ideas about 6 people, particularly 5 women with 1 men themed costumes, please shoot me an email.
Well, it sounds like we'll have some good recommendations coming in for you, at least I hope. So you were talking a little bit there about some of what's going on in the No Surprises Act world. On a consulting side, we've answered a few questions lately about some of the new proposed rules coming in on the NSA. Has that been factoring into what you've been seeing in actual negotiations, or has this been more of a response just generally to these new requirements?
Yeah, so great question. And honestly, what we have seen is that everyone is trying to get a grasp on how the No Surprises Act is going to affect them and standard operating procedures from the provider side to the health plan side. And there's been a lot of a learning curve this year from everyone, right? The regs when they first came out were unclear. They're becoming more clear now. One big thing that we are seeing is the willingness for claims that have been referred to an IDR entity. They're granting extensions on some of the hard and fast timelines because it is a learning curve. There's far more claims than what was anticipated. And so a lot of these IRO entities are being very liberal with some extensions on missed deadlines. When a provider misses a deadline and requests for an extension, we throw that out as a bar to accepting anything over the initial payment amount. But at the end of the day, I think it's probably best for both sides that there's a little bit of leniency on some of those timelines. What has really been interesting to me is a sea change in the way that providers talk about all claims, not just No Surprise Act claims. So I have had far more luck probably since July to just last week in having conversations with providers about objective data to resolve a balance bill. Rewind 18 months ago, this job was very difficult, and it was a lot of back and forth on just this percent of billed charges, this X percent of billed charges. I'm over there screaming about this is unreasonable because of the percent of Medicare. Now, even on No Surprise Act claims, providers are willing to talk about quality data. How do they match up with other providers in the area for their reimbursement? We've had a lot of luck pulling the transparency in coverage data from providers. I've spent a lot of time learning how to read, we're going to get technical here, JSON files and machine readable files, and being able to interpret that and actually seeing what the de-identified minimum and maximums are for certain billed charges, and providers, even if it's not a No Surprise Act claim, being interested in that data for resolution. I've been droning on a minute, but I am going to just throw out a case study here, and then I'll see if I've piqued your interest any. But I had a claim with an attorney for a large health system in your neck of the woods down in Texas. I'm not going to mention the name, but this attorney did mention that they listen to the FIA podcast and attend the FIA webinars to stay up to date on what's going on the other side of the industry. So if you hear my voice, you basically said that it's okay for me to use this case study, mystery attorney. So hopefully it gets back to you. But we had a really great result with a claim. It was for DRG 247, which it was a cardiovascular procedure that involved a stent. And the national average data for that DRG was billing at $91,000. The commercial reimbursement was like $27,500, and they had a de-identified maximum that they were accepting in network of $44,000, and the cash price was $51,000. There was a $102,000 balance, so they were billing higher. They were above the commercial reimbursement average. The initial payment by the plan was higher than the average commercial reimbursement. This was not a No Surprise Act claim, but I was able to jump on a phone call with this attorney. We walked through all these data points, and what happened was they basically said, this was the easiest presentation I've ever made to my client because you laid all this information out, and we really agree that the offer you're making is a fair offer, right? And we looked at the quality data. We looked at their self-published data, and we got to a good result. We settled it for 2.5 times the national Medicare reimbursement average. And again, this was a No Surprise Act claim, but still using those data points to get it done. And actually, I have a phone call with this attorney Friday for a $350,000 balance for a children's hospital claim. So hopefully when we're back together in a month, I got another great case study about how both sides are coming together and really removing the patient from the middle and getting some good results there. So I've talked far too much, and people are like, listen, we like Corey, but we're here for Nick, and we're here for consulting. So what's going on your end, Nick? What's going on over there? What are you seeing?
That's really remarkable what you're saying, that the NSA and those transparency and coverage requirements, some of that's spilling over into even non-NSA claims and kind of putting, more arrows in your quiver to use in these negotiations. And that sort of speaks, even on the plan side, to some of the regulations I was talking about that are sort of, starting to fully take effect, that we're going to start seeing more ripple effects, just like what you're mentioning. Like, for instance, the price comparison tool requirement is going to be kicking off January now. That had been deferred, I think, for most of 2022. We're also seeing like the prescription drug disclosures. Those were effectively, not something we had to worry about for 2020 and 2021. Now those are going to be required to be reported by December of this year. And then for calendar year 2023, something to look forward to in June, I believe, the 2022 data is going to have to be reported. So I think hopefully we can expect some of those unforeseen ripple effects to hopefully spread out and offer a few more avenues for guys like you doing the work that you do to help plans sort of negotiate with some of these providers and these facilities to try to get some of those claims costs down a little bit and help out some of the plans that we work with. Are there any of those regulations that you think are going to shake things up further, or is there anything in particular you're looking out for?
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing that I'm keeping a radar on is we're looking for trends at different IDR entities, right? And I'm not going to mention any names, but we have heard
You mentioned a
rumblings
lot
that
of
there
them
are.
have just been kind of overwhelmed with all of the claims that they're handling now.
Yeah, absolutely. And not just overwhelmed. So, again, I'm not going to mention any IDR entities by name, but we received an email this week that had a spreadsheet of 800 claims on it. And it looked like this particular IDR entity blind copied a ton of non-initiating parties. And we ended up getting to the bottom of it, and they're like, yeah, the FIA group isn't actually named on any of these 800 disputes that we sent you. And I think it was just, a frustration of non-initiating parties not being responsive. And it ended up being we were accidentally copied on something that we really shouldn't have been copied on. But the volume is just overwhelming. And then the thing that we're keeping a trend on, again, I'm not here to disparage anyone by name, but there are starting to be rumblings that, we have some provider favored IDR entities that we want to keep an eye out for. When we hear certain names, they're starting to get a track record of being very provider friendly. And then on the flip side of that, there's also IDR entities that are very plan friendly, right? And I think that is going to be an important thing to keep an eye on moving forward. And then, we're doing a little bit of pre-recording here. We're trying to make this an evergreen podcast, but healthcare is on the ballot next week. Big midterm season. I think that it will be interesting to see how that goes without getting too deep. Listen, I'm not here to steal Brady Bizarro's thunder, and that's our plugged in connection. But I'm keeping an eye on the midterms to see how that breaks, because basically the Biden administration has had a majority control of all three branches, and they've pushed an agenda through. And what is that going to look like starting in January? Is there going to be a switch in that, or is it going to remain status quo? I think that's all very important things that we have to keep an eye on.
Yeah, all key points. Like you said, we're trying to make this as evergreen as possible, but public service announcement. Early voting is going on now here in Texas, at least. If you're hearing this, hopefully it's not too late. I think that's a good point too, that these regulations are sort of still evolving. We've seen big changes on the consulting side in a few of these areas. One of the big ones has been just sort of the trend developing in some of the non-discrimination and transgender issues. We've seen the Biden administration put out new regulations implementing Section 1557, which is essentially the non-discrimination provisions of the ACA, trying to bring that sort of in line with SCOTUS's decision and the Bostock case, basically saying that gender identity is protected under the Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. That also sort of ties into some of the circuit courts we've seen pushing in that direction too. We've seen, I think it's the Fourth Circuit just announced a case maybe a couple months ago now, where they essentially interpreted the Americans with Disabilities Act to apply to protect diagnoses of gender dysphoria as a potential disability under the ADA. So we're sort of seeing this growing trend of greater protections for certain individuals under plans and a growing trend in enforcement of some of those non-discrimination rules. We're also sort of seeing, I think, a growing trend in how some of the regulations just limit what plans are doing, or at least trying to. One of the big things recently was announced the fix to the family glitch. Have you experienced the family glitch, Corey? It doesn't sound like with your 5-to-1 women to men ratio, but the basically the family glitch had been a flaw, an imperfection in the way affordability was being measured for health plans. Essentially, employees with family coverage, their affordability determination would be based on employee-only coverage instead of looking at whether the plan was affordable for them and their family. The new rules sort of fixed that, hopefully, ideally, making health coverage a little more affordable for the average employee. But an interesting twist on that for self-funded plans is that the main enforcement mechanism of that affordability requirement is the employer mandates penalties are kicked in when the employee receives a premium tax credit to get coverage on the exchange, but those are not triggered when their spouse or their dependents get a premium tax credit. So this will actually make it a little easier for some of those dependents to get subsidized coverage on the exchanges, but it shouldn't implicate a greater employer mandate responsibility for most group health plans. So that's sort of that push and pull in a microcosm where there's this push towards a greater requirement being imposed on a health plan, but also sort of, pulling it back because it's not directly impacting things maybe the way the regulators thought it would. And I think we've seen, just like with the IDR entities and the NSA requirements and the transparency and coverage rules, there's all sorts of unforeseen consequences that we're sort of watching unfold as we go.
And there's state responses to these things as well. We were at the all-attorney meeting, I believe that you were on it at FIA last week, and we're keeping our eye on a Washington state law that just went into effect that was expanding charity care and patients being eligible for financial assistance depending on what tier system hospital they're treating. The larger the hospital system, the more generous the charity care is going to be. And that's going to spill over to copays, deductibles, and other patient responsibility amounts that we haven't typically seen charity care expanded to. And, when you look at the No Surprise Act, that was really the forerunner to the federal No Surprises Act was your anti-balance billing statutes in Washington state, your anti-balance billing statutes in Colorado, your anti-balance billing statutes in California. So now we're starting to see some expansion for charity care. So we're prohibiting balance bills and we're expanding charity care in some of those states. And then speaking for where I'm at in Kentucky, what we're seeing a lot in the aftermath of the overturn of Roe is that states are looking at the state constitution to see if a right to privacy exists. In Kentucky, Amendment 2 is on the ballot, and Amendment 2 would say that the Kentucky Constitution cannot be read to have a right to privacy when it comes to abortion. There's a lot of state level responses to going on at the federal level. So it's certainly an interesting time that we live in, and kudos to the PGC service for being able to keep all those, I was going to say balls in the air, but maybe it's chainsaws or bowling pins or some other very difficult thing to juggle, but it's a lot going on.
Yeah, you said it. You said it really well, actually. I think that to mix our metaphor further, we're going to keep seeing where all these dominoes fall. They knock one over, and you never know what's going to get kicked over next. But I think that that's probably a good place for us to kick it off for today. I think you can probably expect us to jump back in. Maybe we'll invite Brady when we want to have a political podcast update here, but we'll see if he's got time here in the next couple of weeks. But Corey, it was a pleasure talking through with you today. Some of the trends coming up in the industry. Do you have any final thoughts to leave us on? Any other things we can juggle? Any other things we can knock down?
We just have provided so much information to the people here, Nick. I'm afraid that if we went any deeper, they would be overwhelmed with the amount of information that the FIA Empowering Plans podcast is providing right now. So I think we better just put a cork in it. We'll put a nice little bow on it. We're heading towards the Christmas season. It'll be here before we know. We'll wrap this up. This podcast will be out sometime in the near future. And just thank everyone for taking the time out of their day to listen to us yammer a little bit. It's always a pleasure to catch up with you, Nick. And hopefully we see each other in person here pretty soon towards the end of the year. So look forward to that as well.
Here's open. Well, thank you, Corey. Thank you, everybody, for listening. Thank you, Pat Santos, our intrepid podcast engineer. That's us signing off for today. Thank you, everybody. Until next time.